Camp Aliceville, Alabama, 1944. The morning sun rose slowly over the red clay fields of Alabama, spilling gold across the barbed wire of Camp Aliceville. Inside the rows of wooden barracks, humidity clung to every wall, thick with pine, dust, and the faint rhythm of American boots on gravel. Joseph Kruger sat on the edge of his bunk, buttoning the faded shirt that had once been part of a German uniform. It was his 27th birthday. Back home in Hamburg, his mother would have baked a dark rye cake filled with raisins, simple, heavy, and warm with molasses. Here, half a world away, that memory felt like something from another life. He glanced around at the men, quiet, hollow-eyed, counting time by mealtime and moonrise. Then the door creaked open. An American sergeant stepped in, holding something unreal, a small round cake made from army flour and sweetened with jam. The room froze. Joseph's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the flickering candle and whispered, "Für mich?" Outside, the cicadas droned on, and mercy, for a moment, felt like sunlight. By the summer of 1944, over 370,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across the United States. Men who had once marched beneath the banners of the Reich, now behind the fences of a country they had been taught to fear. The largest of these enclosures rose quietly in the American South. Among them, Camp Aliceville, nestled in the humid farmlands of Pickens County, Alabama. For men like Joseph Kruger, captured in the final months of the Tunisian campaign, the journey to Alabama had been long and disorienting. They had crossed the Atlantic in gray Liberty ships under tight watch, seasick and silent, their uniforms replaced with simple khaki-marked PW. Many had expected punishment, hard labor, or humiliation. What they found instead was a paradox: confinement that felt almost humane. Camp Aliceville was vast, over 400 acres of wooden barracks, mess halls, workshops, and open fields surrounded by barbed wire. The camp held nearly 6,000 German soldiers, most of them from Rommel's Afrika Korps. They were organized with military precision. Each block had its own leaders, cooks, and clerks. Every man received pay and camp coupons, 3 meals a day, and the right to send censored letters home. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention of 1929 with near-obsessive discipline. Prisoners were allowed to keep personal items, attend religious services, and even stage plays or orchestras. The Red Cross inspected conditions regularly, often reporting that German POWs in Alabama were living better than many civilians in war-torn Europe. Still, suspicion lingered. The prisoners had spent years under propaganda that painted Americans as barbarians, cruel, greedy, without honor. Joseph had believed much of it, but within weeks that image began to crumble. The guards treated them with formality rather than fury. Orders were barked, yes, but without hatred. The meals, stew, cornbread, beans, and coffee, were plentiful. Even the climate, oppressive and foreign, felt strangely alive after the desert and the Atlantic crossing. But what struck Joseph most was the absence of revenge. The Americans did not mock the prisoners. They didn't spit at them, nor make them beg. To a man who had seen what war could turn soldiers into, that restraint felt like a miracle. At night, when the cicadas screamed outside and the air hung heavy with heat, Joseph often lay awake wondering if it was real. He'd whisper quietly to the man in the bunk above him, "Warum? Warum sind sie so anders?" Why? Why are they so different? The answer never came. But with each passing day, his disbelief grew into quiet curiosity, the kind that made him watch the guards not with fear, but with a hesitant kind of respect. Inside the fences of Alabama, he was no longer a soldier. He was a witness to something his generals had never prepared him for. And soon, even the simplest gesture, a loaf of bread, a smile, or a cake, would reveal just how powerful mercy could be. Life inside Camp Aliceville unfolded with a strange kind of rhythm, a war reduced to routine. Each morning, the guards blew whistles before sunrise, and the Germans lined up in dusty formation, their khaki uniforms damp with the Alabama heat. After roll call came breakfast, watery oatmeal, bread, and sometimes eggs. To men who had known hunger on the front, it felt almost luxurious. Josef Kruger soon fell into this rhythm. Assigned to the camp bakery detail, he worked beside both prisoners and American cooks. The ovens, built from salvaged bricks and scrap metal, became his refuge. The smell of yeast and smoke reminded him of Hamburg's narrow streets, of his mother dusting flour from her hands. The Americans didn't trust them with much, but they trusted them with bread. That small act carried meaning Joseph could not yet name. By mid-morning, work teams dispersed across the compound. Some repaired fences, others built furniture or cleared fields outside under guard escort. POW labor was permitted under the Geneva Convention, provided it didn't serve a direct military purpose. In exchange, prisoners earned 80 cents a day in camp coupons, enough to buy cigarettes, stationery, or small treats at the canteen. The canteen itself fascinated Joseph. Behind the counter stood a smiling sergeant named Robert Ellis, a tall man from Tennessee with an accent thick as syrup. He sold soap, postcards, chocolate, and occasionally Coca-Cola. For Joseph, the sight of a German soldier buying an American soda felt like something from another world. "You fellows sure like sugar," Ellis would laugh, counting out coupons. That laughter, casual, unguarded, was perhaps the most disarming weapon in the camp. It chipped away at years of fear. At night, the barracks buzzed with whispered talk. Some prisoners refused to believe the Americans' kindness was real. "It's all a trick," said a former SS corporal one evening. "They're softening us for propaganda." Others disagreed. "No," Joseph replied quietly. "If they wanted to break us, they'd do worse than feed us cake." Culture became the camp's lifeline. The prisoners built a small theater from scrap wood, painted backdrops and staged plays, comedies, even Shakespeare in German. They formed choirs and orchestras, using instruments supplied by the Red Cross. They wrote newspapers, debated politics, and sketched the guards in notebooks. In those moments, captivity felt almost civilized, a fragile world built on decency. But beneath it all ran a silent current of disbelief. These men had fought for an ideology that promised supremacy. Now they were fed by those they had called inferior. That contradiction haunted them. Joseph often stood by the fence in the evenings, watching the sunset burn over the Alabama trees. On the other side, guards smoked, joked, and shared stories of wives and children. There was no hatred in their voices, just fatigue. War, Joseph realized, was ending differently here than anywhere else. Letters from home deepened that contrast. News from Germany told of bombings, hunger, and despair. In Aliceville there was order, warmth, and food. Many prisoners began to wonder if the enemy they'd fought was, in truth, more human than the leaders they had obeyed. By late 1944, a quiet transformation had begun. The men no longer stood at attention out of fear, but from habit. They worked, laughed, and waited, not for release, but for understanding. And for Josef Kruger, that understanding would come not through speeches or books, but through something so ordinary it felt impossible: a birthday cake baked by his captors. For the German prisoners, captivity had stripped away more than freedom. It had stripped away certainty. Every small kindness from the Americans chipped at the image they had been taught since childhood: that mercy was weakness, that compassion was a trick, that the enemy was something less than human. For Josef Kruger, this confusion became a kind of haunting. He had once imagined America as a land of arrogance and greed, a place that despised his people. Yet each day brought proof to the contrary. When he worked in the bakery, American guards would stop by, drawn by the smell of bread. One afternoon, a young corporal named Samuel Lewis stood by the doorway, grinning as Joseph pulled a loaf from the oven. "Smells like home, don't it?" Lewis said, wiping sweat from his brow. Joseph didn't answer. His English was halting, uncertain. But the smile that crossed the guard's face didn't fade. It was a small, wordless truce between men who might have killed each other months before. In the barracks, that same feeling began to spread. The prisoners noticed things: guards sharing cigarettes, offering extra rations when storms flooded the fields, turning away when someone smuggled bread back for a sick friend. No one had expected this kind of decency. It confused them more deeply than punishment ever could. Each act of mercy felt like an accusation, not against America, but against everything they had once believed about strength and victory. The older soldiers argued late into the night. "This is not mercy," one insisted. "This is power in disguise." But Joseph wasn't so sure. One evening, while mending a torn shirt by lantern light, he wrote quietly in his notebook, "If power can afford to be kind, perhaps it has already won." He didn't know why he wrote it, only that it felt true. Even the camp's strict discipline carried a strange gentleness. Guards enforced order without cruelty. Punishment was rare, reserved for escape attempts or fights, and even then it was measured. To Joseph, it was as if the Americans had chosen dignity as their weapon. They didn't need to humiliate their captives. Their calmness did that for them. When Sundays came, the chapel bell rang not just for the guards, but for the prisoners too. Protestant, Catholic, atheist, it didn't matter. Men who had once shouted "Heil Hitler" now bowed their heads beside the very soldiers who had defeated them. The irony was not lost on anyone. And yet, beneath the surface, something fragile was being rebuilt. Trust. Not friendship, not yet, but recognition. The understanding that even enemies could share the same hunger, the same loneliness, the same longing for decency. Joseph began sketching the faces of his captors in his notebook. The lines of exhaustion around their eyes, the way they squinted into the sun. He wasn't sure why, but it helped him remember that war was made of men, not monsters, and in that slow awakening, mercy became contagious. Because kindness, once seen, could not be unseen, and for the first time, Joseph wondered what kind of man he would be when the gates finally opened. Inside Camp Aliceville, the prisoners saw a microcosm of that abundance. The canteen shelves gleamed with things that hadn't been seen in Germany for years: soap, candy, fruit, canned peaches, pencils. There were books in German, donated by churches and universities. There were sports fields, musical instruments, even a library. None of it made sense. Joseph Kruger once stood in front of the canteen window staring at a stack of glossy magazines. The guard behind the counter, the same Sergeant Ellis who often joked with him, slid one toward him and said, "Take it, pal. Helps the time go by." Joseph hesitated. In his world, the victor did not give gifts to the defeated. But in America, generosity was not performance. It was reflex. This, more than any propaganda, broke through the wall between captor and captive. For the guards, these gestures were small. For the prisoners, they were disorienting acts of moral power. They began to notice how the Americans viewed order not through fear, but through fairness. Rules existed, but they weren't arbitrary. When a guard punished a man for fighting, he explained why. When a prisoner worked hard, he was praised. That kind of justice, consistent, impartial, was alien to men who had grown up under a regime where fear was the law. Even food told the story. Every day, steaming trays of beans, bread, and meat arrived from the kitchens. To German eyes, it was excess. But what stunned them wasn't the portion. It was the equality. The guards ate the same food. There was no special privilege, no reminder of hierarchy. That unspoken equality humbled men who had once believed they were destined to rule others. At night, some of the POWs played music on the camp stage. Violins, harmonicas, makeshift drums. American guards sometimes gathered to listen. They clapped at the end, shouted "Encore!" and laughed when the Germans played swing or jazz. The same rhythms once banned in Hitler's Reich now echoed freely in Alabama. Joseph found himself watching these moments with quiet awe. "They don't understand how powerful this is," he wrote in his notebook. "They are teaching us without knowing it." And he was right. The power wasn't in the rifles or fences. It was in the unshakable confidence that allowed the victors to show kindness without fear of losing. Authority. It was a lesson no book or speech could have taught. By the end of 1944, that understanding began to spread among the men of Aliceville. The guards had not converted them politically, but morally they had planted a seed. The idea that strength could coexist with mercy, that a great nation didn't need to crush its enemies to prove itself. And soon, on one quiet morning, that lesson would take its most human form, baked in flour, sugar, and compassion. It began like any other morning. The sun climbed through a veil of Alabama mist, pressing warmth into the red soil of Camp Aliceville. Dew hung from the barbed wire like glass beads. Somewhere near the mess hall, a harmonica played a slow tune, something American, lazy, and haunting. Joseph Kruger buttoned his shirt, brushed the dust from his trousers, and joined the others for roll call. The guards counted names with practiced indifference. Behind them, the smell of baking drifted through the humid air, a smell too sweet, too familiar. Joseph paused. Flour, sugar, something burnt. It didn't belong in a prison camp. By late morning, whispers had spread through the barracks. "The guards are baking," someone said. "For who?" another asked. Nobody knew. The answer came after noon, when Sergeant Robert Ellis appeared at the door with a clipboard under his arm and a grin that didn't belong to war. "All right, boys," he said. "Line up outside." The prisoners obeyed, confused but curious. On a long wooden table outside the mess hall sat a row of small, uneven cakes, round, imperfect, each with a single candle. The icing was crude, made from rationed sugar and cocoa, but to the prisoners it looked impossible, almost sacred. "This one's for you, Kruger," Ellis said, setting a plate before him. Joseph stared at it. A real cake, baked by his captors, the candle flickering in the southern breeze. Around him the camp had gone utterly silent. A few men laughed nervously. Others looked away, ashamed of the tears forming in their eyes. Joseph's throat tightened. He thought of his mother in Hamburg, of the bakery where he once worked, of the birthdays he had missed since Tunisia. His lips trembled as he whispered, barely audible. "For mich?" Ellis nodded. "That's right. For you." For a long moment no one moved. The gesture was so small, so human, that it broke something deep inside the prisoners. A tension carried across continents and battles. Joseph reached out, his hands trembling, and touched the soft edge of the cake. It was warm, real. When he finally took a bite, the sweetness hit him like memory. For a heartbeat, he wasn't a prisoner. He was just a man. The men around him clapped awkwardly, unsure if it was allowed. A few guards joined in. Laughter rippled through the Alabama air, light and hesitant. The first laughter born of mercy, not mockery. In that instant, the war seemed far away, and for the first time since his capture, Joseph Kruger smiled. Not because he was free, but because someone had reminded him what freedom meant. The birthday cakes didn't end with Joseph. Within days, word spread through every barracks at Camp Aliceville. A story too strange to believe. Men who had seen tanks burn and cities fall now whispered about a single afternoon when Americans baked for Germans. The next morning, something subtle changed. During roll call, the lines stood straighter, not from fear, but from a quiet sense of respect. When the guards shouted orders, the replies came firm, not resentful. And in the bakery, where Joseph worked with two other prisoners, the ovens burned hotter than ever. "Let's bake something for them," said Eric Voss, the camp's youngest baker, barely 20. Joseph hesitated. "You mean, for the guards?" Eric nodded. "They gave us cake. Why shouldn't we give them bread?" It was against regulations. Prisoners weren't supposed to prepare food for guards. But small rebellions of kindness had a way of going unnoticed. That evening, when Ellis came to check on them, he found a row of loaves cooling on the counter, crusted, golden, fragrant. "They're for you," Joseph said quietly in broken English. The sergeant didn't speak for a moment. He simply stared, then let out a long breath that sounded more like relief than surprise. "You boys," he muttered, shaking his head with a grin, "you really don't know when to quit being human." The next day, the guards shared those loaves during their meal, and something invisible crossed the fence that had divided them. After that, the camp's tone shifted. The Americans stopped seeing enemies. The Germans stopped seeing monsters. There were still boundaries, of course, salutes, orders, regulations. But beneath it all, something gentler had taken root. Men began painting murals on the barracks walls, landscapes of home, faces of loved ones, and even caricatures of the guards. When one sketch showed Ellis juggling loaves of bread, the sergeant pinned it on the mess hall wall instead of tearing it down. The Red Cross inspector visiting that month noted in his report, "Morale at Aliceville unusually high. Interaction between guards and prisoners characterized by mutual respect and occasional laughter. Treatment remains exemplary." But no report could capture what really happened, how a handful of sugar and flour had rewritten the meaning of victory. Joseph wrote in his notebook that night, "It is strange. They have beaten us without hatred. Perhaps that is why it hurts the most." The candle from his birthday cake had long melted away, but its light lingered, glowing quietly in the hearts of men who would carry its warmth back across the ocean long after the war had ended. By late 1945, the war in Europe had ended, but behind the fences of Camp Aliceville, the lessons of captivity were still unfolding. Official records show that more than 425,000 German prisoners of war were held across the United States, spread through nearly 700 camps in every corner of the country. Among them, Aliceville stood out for its quiet success. No major riots, no executions, no escapes. American military authorities had treated the camp as a living demonstration of the Geneva Convention, a chance to show that democracy's strength was not built on fear, but on discipline and dignity. Reports from the War Department described conditions as excellent. Inspections by the International Red Cross echoed that praise, noting that German POWs received adequate housing, medical care, and wages comparable to American soldiers. But what inspectors could not record was the transformation happening in the minds of the prisoners themselves. Letters sent home to Germany, carefully censored but still personal, began carrying an unexpected tone. Instead of bitterness or despair, many described a growing sense of respect, even admiration, for their captors. A Red Cross clerk later recalled reading one letter from Aliceville that simply said, "We are treated as men here, not as enemies. Tell Mother not to worry." Another letter, written by a former Africa Corps soldier, reached Hamburg months later. It read, "The Americans gave us bread, books, and music. They even remembered birthdays. I don't know what to believe anymore." Historians would later call it America's quiet victory. Not the one won with bombs or invasions, but with restraint. Every meal served, every respectful word spoken, was part of an unspoken campaign to prove that justice and humanity could coexist, even in war. The U.S. government, aware that these prisoners would one day return home, encouraged this approach. Psychological analysts from the Office of War Information argued that humane treatment could plant seeds of democracy more effectively than propaganda leaflets. The strategy worked. By the time repatriation began in 1946, surveys showed that over 90% of German POWs held in America described their experience as fair or excellent. Many later admitted that it had reshaped their understanding of freedom, not as a word, but as behavior. Joseph Kruger, though fictional in this telling, represents thousands of men whose real testimonies echo the same astonishment, that in captivity they had seen decency from the enemy they feared most. And for those men, returning to a shattered Germany, that memory would burn brighter than any flag or uniform. A memory of a birthday cake under the Alabama sun, baked by the hands of former enemies who had chosen compassion over vengeance. When the war finally ended, Camp Aliceville began to empty. One by one, the men who had arrived as soldiers and lived as prisoners boarded trains bound for the ports, New Orleans, New York, Boston, from which they would cross the Atlantic once more. But they were not the same men who had come ashore 2 years earlier, hollow-eyed and defiant. For Joseph Kruger, the journey home felt like waking from a strange, merciful dream. The train rumbled through cotton fields, towns, and rivers, past people who waved instead of jeered. Guards shared coffee with prisoners. Children on station platforms handed out candy bars. It was a quiet farewell, and an unspoken message. Remember this when you go home. Back in Germany, the returning POWs stepped into ruin. Cities lay in ashes. Families had vanished. Hunger replaced ideology. Yet many of those who had spent their captivity in America carried something invisible, a conviction that decency could survive even catastrophe. They spoke of their treatment not as luxury, but as revelation. Historians later noted that post-war surveys conducted by the U.S. Army's Information Control Division found a striking trend. Former POWs held in America were among the most moderate and pro-democratic citizens in occupied Germany. Having seen freedom's discipline up close, they returned as living contradictions to the regime they had once served. Some would later write memoirs about their time in Alabama, Texas, or Wisconsin. In those pages, one theme returned again and again. Not the fences, but the faces. The guard who shared his cigarette. The chaplain who offered communion to everyone. The baker who remembered a prisoner's birthday. In 1989, decades after the war, the town of Aliceville built a museum on the old campgrounds. Among the artifacts, photographs, letters, uniforms, sits a small hand-drawn recipe card written in German. It lists flour, sugar, eggs, and jam. And at the bottom, a single word, Dankbarkeit, gratitude. It was donated by a former POW who had returned to visit. Now an old man with white hair and a soft southern accent he had somehow kept. When asked why he came back, he said, "Because this was where I learned that enemies don't have to stay enemies." The story of those cakes, of that day in 1944, lives quietly in archives and memories. But its meaning endures. That power without hatred is stronger than any weapon. And mercy, offered freely, can outlast the walls built by war. And somewhere in the red clay of Alabama, beneath the pines, the echoes of laughter between guards and prisoners still linger. Proof that even in captivity, humanity can win. History often remembers wars by the battles that ended them, by maps, flags, and the signatures beneath surrender. But the quiet victories, the ones that changed hearts rather than borders, rarely make the pages of textbooks. Camp Aliceville was one of those silent victories. In that humid corner of Alabama, surrounded by barbed wire and pine trees, an act as small as baking a cake became a statement of principle. It said that strength did not need cruelty to prove itself, that true victory was measured not in the number of enemies defeated, but in the humanity preserved. For men like Josef Kruger, that realization reshaped everything. The war had taught him to obey, to distrust, to harden himself against pity. But captivity, in the hands of those he once called enemies, taught him the opposite, that mercy could rebuild what ideology had broken. He had entered those fences as a soldier of the Reich. He would leave them as a witness to decency. The Americans, too, understood the quiet weight of what they'd done. Their kindness wasn't a gesture of charity. It was discipline, rooted in faith that democracy could afford compassion without losing authority. They treated their captives not as symbols of evil, but as men who had lost their way. And in doing so, they proved that humanity, when guarded by conscience, could survive even the age of total war. Decades later, when historians looked back on the POW camps of the United States, they found few tales of revenge, but thousands of memories like Joseph's. A loaf of bread, a song shared, a cake with a single candle. Each one was a reminder that morality, once tested by war, can emerge stronger than before. The fences of Aliceville were torn down long ago. The red soil has reclaimed what was once a prison. But somewhere in that southern wind, between the fields and the ghosts of barracks long vanished, lingers the faintest echo of laughter, of disbelief, of a man whispering, "Für mich?" A question once born of shock. That became the answer to everything war had forgotten.